The mashed potatoes were getting cold, and Uncle Robert was already 3 beers deep into his annual lecture about lazy millennials when my cousin Amanda decided to twist the knife a little deeper. She looked right at me across the dinner table and said, "At least some of us have real careers, unlike certain people who just vanished for 2 years. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss." What happened next would change everything my family thought they knew about me. But let me start from the beginning. My name is Emma Carter, and growing up in Fresno, California, I was what you might call the family black sheep, not in any dramatic way. I wasn't getting arrested or causing scandals. I was just directionless. Average grades, no standout talents, and a tendency to drift through life without much ambition. My older brother Daniel had graduated magna cum laude from Stanford with a degree in computer science. He landed a six-figure job at Google before he turned 26. My younger sister Rachel was the family's golden girl valedictorian in high school, full scholarship to Berkeley, and now working as a successful pediatric resident in San Francisco. Even my cousin Amanda, who lived 3 states away, managed to become a marketing director and was constantly being praised by my aunt for building her own empire. Then there was me, 24 years old, living in my childhood bedroom, working part-time at a local coffee shop, and spending most of my free time binge-watching Netflix or hiking alone in the Sierra Nevada foothills. Family gatherings had become exercises in enduring well-meaning but cutting comments about my potential and when I was going to find my direction. The worst part wasn't even the direct criticism. It was the way conversations would pause when I entered a room, the awkward silences when someone asked what I'd been up to lately, and the concerned looks my mom would give me when she thought I wasn't watching. I had become the cautionary tale, the example of what happens when you don't apply yourself. 2 years ago, everything changed, but nobody in my family knew it yet. It started on a particularly devastating day in November. I'd been rejected for another job, this time at a local marketing firm where I'd hoped to at least get an entry-level position. The hiring manager had been polite but clear. They were looking for someone with more drive, more ambition. As I walked out of that building, something inside me shattered. Not in an angry way, but in a way that made everything suddenly crystal clear. I drove straight to the military recruitment center downtown. Staff Sergeant Johnson was a no-nonsense woman with steel gray hair and eyes that seemed to see right through any excuse you might try to give her. When I told her I wanted to join the Navy, she didn't sugarcoat anything. The training would be brutal. The commitment was serious. And if I was looking for an easy escape from my problems, I was in the wrong place. But something about the way she spoke resonated with me. For the first time in years, someone was offering me a real challenge, instead of another participation trophy or gentle suggestion about exploring my options. Within 2 weeks, I had signed my enlistment papers. I told my family I was taking a job opportunity that required me to relocate. It wasn't technically a lie, and I wasn't ready to deal with their skepticism or worse, their pity if I failed. My mom cried when I hugged her goodbye, assuming I was probably going to mess this up too, but trying to be supportive. My dad shook my hand and told me to stay safe with the weary tone of someone who had stopped expecting much. Boot camp at Naval Station Great Lakes was everything. Staff Sergeant Johnson had promised and worse. The first week, I questioned every decision that had led me there. The physical training pushed my body beyond anything I thought possible. The mental pressure was relentless. Drill instructors seemed to have a supernatural ability to find and exploit every weakness, every moment of doubt. But something unexpected happened around week 4. I stopped breaking down and started building up. The discipline that had always felt restrictive in civilian life began to feel empowering. The structure gave me something I hadn't realized I'd been missing: a clear sense of purpose and the tools to achieve it. More importantly, I discovered I was exceptional at this. Really exceptional. My marksmanship scores were consistently in the top 3%. I excelled at tactical planning and navigation. During team exercises, other recruits started looking to me for leadership, and I found myself naturally stepping into those roles. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just keeping up, I was setting the standard. My company commander, Chief Petty Officer Davis, pulled me aside during week 7. "Carter," she said, Have you given any thought to special warfare programs? I hadn't, mainly because I'd never imagined myself as someone who could handle that level of intensity. But Chief Davis saw something I was just beginning to recognize in myself. She handed me a packet of information about various special operations programs and told me to think it over seriously. That night, lying in my rack while my fellow recruits slept, I read through every page twice. The Navy SEALs program stood out immediately. The requirements were intimidating. The physical standards alone would eliminate most candidates before they even started. But reading about the training, the missions, the level of excellence expected, I felt something I'd never experienced before: genuine excitement about a challenge. The selection process for SEAL training was unlike anything I'd faced. The initial screening pushed every candidate to their absolute limits, and beyond. Of the 38 women who started the assessment with me, only 12 made it through to basic underwater demolition SEAL training, known as BUD-S. BUD-S was legendary among military personnel for its brutality. Hell Week alone, 5.5 days of continuous training with a maximum of 4 hours of sleep total, had a failure rate that made grown warriors reconsider their life choices. The instructors weren't just testing physical capabilities, they were looking for something deeper: mental resilience, the ability to function when everything in your body and mind was screaming at you to quit. I won't pretend it was easy. There were moments during Hell Week when I seriously considered ringing the bell that would end my training immediately. During one particularly brutal surf torture session, lying in the freezing Pacific Ocean while instructors screamed at us to maintain our positions, I remember thinking about my warm childhood bedroom back in Fresno, about how disappointed but not surprised my family would be if I came home having failed at this too. But then I thought about Chief Davis, who had seen potential in me when I couldn't see it myself. About Staff Sergeant Johnson, who had challenged me to stop making excuses. About the version of myself I was becoming, someone who didn't quit when things got impossible. I didn't ring the bell. Of the 12 women who started BUD-S with me, 4 of us graduated. 6 months later, I was officially a Navy SEAL, assigned to SEAL Team 7 based out of Naval Amphibious Base Coronado. The transformation wasn't just physical, though the training had certainly changed my body in ways I never thought possible. It was mental and emotional. I had learned to push past barriers I'd thought were absolute limits. I had developed skills in combat, strategy, and leadership that placed me among the most elite military personnel in the world. But my family knew none of this. As far as they were concerned, I had simply vanished into some vague job opportunity and had been too busy or ashamed to stay in regular contact. I sent occasional texts to let them know I was alive and well, but I kept the details deliberately vague. Part of me wanted to tell them, especially during the hardest moments of training when their support might have meant everything. But a bigger part of me needed to prove something to myself first. I needed to know that this wasn't just another phase I'd quit when it got difficult. I needed to earn the right to wear the Trident insignia before I could earn their respect. 2 years of deployment and specialized training later, I had been promoted to lieutenant and had earned commendations that most career military personnel never achieve. I had led missions in hostile territory, trained foreign military units, and developed expertise in underwater demolitions and counter-terrorism operations that made me a valuable asset to my team and my country. But none of that mattered to my family, because they didn't know any of it existed. Which brings us back to Thanksgiving dinner, 2024, and the moment when everything was about to change. The flight from San Diego to Fresno gave me 2 hours to mentally prepare for what I knew would be an uncomfortable evening. I hadn't been home for Thanksgiving in 2 years, and my mom's voicemails had become increasingly worried and guilt-laden as the holiday approached. She'd finally worn me down with a particularly emotional message about how the family just isn't complete without all my children together. I stared out the airplane window at the California landscape below, thinking about how different I was from the person who had left this place. The physical changes were obvious. I'd gained 25 pounds of muscle, and carried myself with a confidence that came from knowing exactly what my body was capable of under extreme stress. But the mental changes ran deeper. I had seen and done things that most people couldn't imagine, worked alongside some of the most elite warriors in the world, and earned a level of respect that had nothing to do with family connections or social expectations. Yet none of that seemed to matter as I pulled into my parents' driveway and saw the familiar collection of cars that meant everyone was already here. Daniel's pristine Audi, Rachel's hybrid Prius, and my aunt's SUV with the honor student bumper stickers for Amanda's younger siblings. I sat in my rental car for a moment, collecting myself and wondering if I should have just stayed on base. The front door opened before I could even knock, and my mom practically tackled me with a hug that lasted long enough to become slightly awkward. She stepped back and looked me over with the careful eye of someone inspecting a long-lost possession for damage. "You look different," she said, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what had changed. "Stronger. Have you been working out?" "A little," I said, which was technically accurate if you considered daily physical training that would hospitalize most civilian athletes to be a little exercise. The house smelled like turkey and stuffing, and the particular combination of vanilla candles and cleaning products that my mom deployed for major holidays. Voices drifted from the living room, the familiar sound of my family catching up on each other's lives and accomplishments. I took a deep breath and walked in to face the music. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Emma. Rachel jumped up from the couch where she'd been showing everyone photos on her phone from her medical residency. She'd lost some weight since I'd last seen her, the kind that comes from too many hospital shifts and not enough regular meals. Her hug was warm but brief, and I could see her trying to process the changes in my appearance. Daniel gave me a more careful embrace, his programmer's mind clearly analyzing the data. "You've definitely been hitting the gym," he said. "What kind of work are you doing again? You've been pretty secretive about the details." Before I could answer, my cousin Amanda chimed in from across the room. "Still keeping secrets about your mysterious job? Come on, Emma. It can't be that exciting. You're not exactly the action hero type." The comment stung, but not in the way it would have 3 years ago. Back then, it would have reinforced my own insecurities about not measuring up. Now it just felt like an outdated assessment from people who had stopped paying attention to who I was becoming. "I work in security," I said, which was both true and sufficiently vague to avoid follow-up questions. My Uncle Robert looked up from his beer with the slightly glazed expression of someone who had started drinking before the football game ended. "Security guard, like at a shopping center or something." "Something like that," I replied, catching my dad's sympathetic wince from across the room. Dinner conversation followed the predictable pattern. Daniel updated everyone on his latest promotion and the startup company that was trying to recruit him. Rachel talked about her residency program and the research project she was leading at UCSF. Amanda described her marketing campaigns and her recent promotion to regional director. When the conversation turned to me, the energy shifted noticeably. My aunt asked about my security job with the kind of forced enthusiasm people use when talking to children about their finger paintings. My dad tried to steer the conversation away from potentially uncomfortable topics, but Amanda seemed determined to probe the wound. "It's just that we all expected you to, I don't know, find something more challenging by now," she said, cutting into her turkey with surgical precision. "I mean, you're smart enough. You just never seem to want to push yourself beyond your comfort zone." My mom jumped in with defensive parental instincts. "Emma has always been a late bloomer. Some people just need more time to figure out their path." The condescension in that simple statement hit harder than any direct insult could have. I was being discussed like a problem to be solved, or a disappointment to be explained away. Uncle Robert, now fully warmed up by his pre-dinner beers, decided to add his own wisdom to the situation. "What Emma needs is some real discipline," he announced, waving his fork for emphasis. "Military service. That's what would straighten her out. Teach her responsibility, respect, how to push through when things get tough instead of giving up at the first sign of difficulty." The irony was so perfect I almost laughed out loud. Here was Uncle Robert, who had spent exactly 8 months in the Air Force Reserves 25 years ago, and never deployed anywhere more dangerous than a weekend training exercise, lecturing me about military discipline. "Robert," my aunt said quietly, "Emma doesn't live at home anymore." "Right, she's got her big security guard job now," Robert continued, apparently missing the warning signs that he was crossing into genuinely hurtful territory. But what's she really accomplished? Where's the ambition? The drive? When I was her age, I had goals, plans, and a vision for my future. I caught Daniel's uncomfortable glance and Rachel's subtle headshake trying to get Uncle Robert to change subjects. Even Amanda looked like she was regretting opening this particular can of worms. But Robert was on a roll now, fueled by alcohol and the peculiar satisfaction that comes from tearing someone else down to make yourself feel bigger. You know what your problem is, Emma? Robert leaned forward, pointing his fork at me like a weapon. You never learned to push yourself. You never learned what real pressure feels like. You've spent your whole life taking the easy way out, and now you're stuck in some dead-end job because you don't have what it takes to handle anything demanding. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. My mom looked mortified. My dad was clearly debating whether to intervene or let me handle it myself. Daniel and Rachel were studying their plates like they contained the secrets of the universe. I looked around the table at these people who loved me, but had never really known me, who had watched me struggle with direction and purpose, but had never seen me overcome anything difficult. In their minds, I was still the aimless 24-year-old who had drifted through life without accomplishing anything meaningful. And technically, they weren't wrong about that person. That version of Emma Carter really lacked drive and ambition. She really had taken the easy way out when things got difficult. She really had been something of a disappointment. But that person had died somewhere in the freezing waters off Coronado during Hell Week. She had been replaced by someone who had earned the right to wear one of the most respected insignias in the military. Someone who had completed missions that most people would consider impossible. Someone who had proven herself under conditions that would break most individuals. The problem was, none of them knew that person existed. I was about to let Uncle Robert's comments slide, the way I always had. Old habits die hard, and part of me was still that conflict-avoidant kid who preferred to keep the peace rather than defend herself. I was mentally preparing my usual response, a self-deprecating joke or a quick subject change, that would let everyone move on without further awkwardness. That's when the doorbell rang. We all looked at each other with confusion. Mom had specifically said dinner was family only this year. Dad wasn't expecting anyone. The delivery companies were all closed for the holiday. I'll get it, my dad said, standing up with the slightly stiff movements of someone who had spent too long sitting at a dinner table. We could hear muffled voices from the front door, my dad's tone shifting from confusion to what sounded like surprise. The conversation went on longer than a typical solicitor or neighbor would warrant, and we all found ourselves straining to hear what was happening. When my dad returned to the dining room, his expression was unreadable. Behind him walked two women in dress blue uniforms that I recognized immediately, but that probably meant nothing to my civilian family. Master Chief Petty Officer Williams, my former instructor from Advanced Tactical Training, and Lieutenant Commander Brooks, my current commanding officer. Both of them looked exactly like what they were, elite military personnel who had spent years earning the right to wear those uniforms and the ribbons that decorated them. They moved with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from facing down situations where failure means people die. The effect on my family was immediate and obvious. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Uncle Robert actually sat up straighter in his chair. Everyone was suddenly very aware that they were in the presence of people who commanded a level of respect they rarely encountered in their daily lives. "Sorry to interrupt your family dinner," Williams said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made people listen carefully. "We were hoping to speak with Lieutenant Carter." The confusion on my family's faces was almost comical. They were all looking around the room as if some other Carter might materialize to claim this obviously important visit. Lieutenant Commander Brooks stepped forward with the kind of precise movement that spoke of decades of military training. "We have something that belongs to her." The silence in the dining room was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop as my family processed what they had just heard. "Lieutenant Carter." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot, impossible to ignore, and completely reshaping everything they thought they knew about the situation. Uncle Robert's fork was frozen halfway to his mouth, a piece of turkey dangling from it like he'd forgotten how to complete the motion of eating. Daniel's engineering mind was clearly working overtime, trying to reconcile the data he was receiving with his existing assumptions. Rachel had gone completely still, her usual confident demeanor replaced by something approaching shock. My mom looked like she was seeing a ghost. She kept glancing between me and the two naval officers, as if she expected someone to tell her this was an elaborate joke or a case of mistaken identity. I could feel the weight of everyone's stare, but I kept my focus on Williams and Brooks. These women had traveled hours on a national holiday to find me, which meant something significant had happened. In our world, unscheduled visits from commanding officers rarely brought good news. "What's the situation?" I asked, automatically shifting into the professional tone I used with fellow service members. Lieutenant Commander Brooks reached into her jacket and pulled out an official envelope with Navy letterhead. "Your orders came through, Lieutenant. You ship out Tuesday for the joint operation we discussed." The words were careful, coded in the way military personnel spoke when civilians were present. Joint operation could mean anything from a training exercise to something classified that my family definitely shouldn't hear about. But I understood the subtext. This was important enough that they couldn't wait for normal channels. "Tuesday," I confirmed, running through the mental checklist of what I'd need to arrange in the next 4 days. "Affirmative. Your team specifically requested you for this one. Apparently, your expertise in underwater demolitions made you the first choice." Williams stepped forward with a slight smile. "Plus, Lieutenant Commander Hayes mentioned your performance during the harbor infiltration exercise last month. Said you made it look effortless." The casual mention of underwater demolitions and harbor infiltration had the effect of a hand grenade going off in my parents' dining room. These weren't terms associated with mall security guards or any other civilian job my family might have imagined I was doing. Amanda had gone pale. Her marketing background probably gave her enough strategic thinking to realize that underwater demolitions wasn't something you learned in a typical workplace training program. Uncle Robert's earlier lecture about needing military discipline to straighten me out was aging like milk in the sun. My dad cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the continued silence. "Excuse me," he said, his voice strained with confusion and something that might have been pride fighting with disbelief. "Are you saying that Emma is—" "Navy SEAL, sir," Williams answered before Dad could finish the question. "Lieutenant Carter is one of our finest operators. We're fortunate to have her." The impact of those words was immediate and devastating to every assumption my family had built over the past 2 years. Navy SEAL, not security guard, not dead-end job, not lack of ambition or drive. Navy SEAL, a designation that carried weight even among people who knew nothing about military special operations. Uncle Robert's face had gone through several color changes, finally settling on a shade of red that suggested his blood pressure was reaching dangerous levels. The man who had just finished lecturing me about needing military discipline was now faced with the reality that I had not only received that discipline, but had excelled at it beyond anything he had achieved in his brief and unremarkable military service. "There must be some mistake," my mom said weakly, though her voice suggested she was beginning to understand there was no mistake at all. Lieutenant Commander Brooks turned to address her directly, her tone respectful but matter-of-fact. "No mistake, ma'am. Your daughter has served with distinction for the past 2 years. Her record includes commendations for valor, expert marksmanship, and leadership under fire." Each word was like a small explosion in the room. Commendations for valor, expert marksmanship, leadership under fire. These weren't concepts my family associated with the Emma they thought they knew. Daniel found his voice first, though it came out higher pitched than usual. But you said you worked in security." I looked at him, then at the rest of my family, all of whom were staring at me like I had suddenly sprouted a second head. "I do work in security," I said quietly. "National security." The joke fell flat because nobody was in the mood for humor. They were too busy recalibrating everything they thought they understood about their family dynamic. Rachel, who had always been the golden child, the one with the impressive career and bright future, looked like someone had just told her that her big sister had secretly become an astronaut. "You're a Navy SEAL," she said, not as a question but as someone trying to make the words feel real by saying them out loud. "For 2 years now," I confirmed. Williams glanced at her watch, a subtle reminder that they had other obligations. "Lieutenant, we'll need confirmation on those orders." I nodded, my mind already shifting to operational mode. "Understood. I'll report for a briefing on Monday morning." "Outstanding. Your gear is already staged, and transport is arranged." She turned to address my family with the formal courtesy that military personnel showed to civilians. "We apologize again for interrupting your holiday dinner." Lieutenant Carter, enjoy the rest of your leave. Both women executed precise about faces and headed back toward the front door, leaving behind a dining room full of people who looked like they had just witnessed something supernatural. The front door closed with a soft click that seemed to echo through the house. For a long moment, nobody moved or spoke. The turkey was getting cold, but nobody seemed to care about finishing dinner anymore. Uncle Robert was the first to break the silence, though his voice came out as barely more than a whisper. Navy SEAL. My aunt reached over and actually took the beer out of his hand, apparently deciding he had consumed enough alcohol for one evening given the circumstances. Emma, my mom said, her voice shaking slightly. Is this real? Are you really? Yeah, Mom. It's real. The questions came in a flood after that. How long had I been planning this? Why hadn't I told them? What kind of training did Navy SEALs do? Where had I been deployed? What was this mission they were talking about? I answered what I could without violating operational security, explaining the basics of BUDS training, the physical and mental requirements, and the selection process that eliminated most candidates before they even got started. I told them about some of the non-classified training exercises, the international cooperation missions, the counter-terrorism work that didn't involve details they weren't cleared to hear. But even the sanitized version was enough to paint a picture that completely contradicted everything they thought they knew about me. This wasn't someone who lacked discipline or drive. This was someone who had volunteered for and completed some of the most demanding training in the world. Daniel, ever the engineer, wanted to understand the technical aspects. What exactly does underwater demolitions involve? Explosive ordnance disposal in maritime environments, I explained. Clearing harbors, removing obstacles from landing zones, disabling enemy assets below the waterline. The clinical description didn't capture the reality of swimming through dark water with enough explosives to level a building, working by feel in conditions where a single mistake could kill you and everyone on your team. But it was enough to help him understand that this wasn't a job you got by sending in a resume. Rachel was struggling with the leadership aspects. You said leadership under fire. What does that mean exactly? It means I've been responsible for the safety and mission success of other highly trained operators in hostile environments, I said carefully. It means making decisions when lives depend on getting it right the first time. The weight of that responsibility was something I carried every day, but it was also something that had forged me into a version of myself that I was genuinely proud of. The scared, directionless kid they remembered had been replaced by someone who could be trusted with the most critical missions her country could offer. Amanda had been quiet through most of the questioning, but I could see her processing everything through her business background. She understood better than the others what kind of mental toughness it took to complete training that eliminated 90% of candidates. The underwater demolitions training, she said slowly. How long can you hold your breath? Over 6 minutes in combat conditions, I replied. Longer if I'm not carrying gear. The number hit them like a physical blow. Most people struggle to hold their breath for 60 seconds. 6 minutes while potentially under enemy fire was beyond anything they could imagine. My dad had been quiet through most of this, but I could see him working through the implications. His daughter, who he had worried about for years, who had seemed to lack direction and purpose, had not only found her calling but had excelled at it beyond most people's wildest dreams. The mission they mentioned, he said finally. Is it dangerous? I looked at him for a long moment, weighing my answer. There was no point in lying anymore, but there was also no reason to terrify them with details they couldn't change anyway. All the missions are dangerous, Dad. That's why they send us instead of regular Navy personnel. The truth of that statement settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Their family disappointment was actually their family hero, and they were just now finding out about it. The next hour transformed our family dynamic in ways that 2 decades of holiday dinners hadn't managed to accomplish. Once the initial shock wore off, the questions became more personal, more searching. They weren't just trying to understand what I did for a living anymore. They were trying to understand who I had become. My mom kept touching my arm as if she needed physical confirmation that I was real and sitting at their table. But when you left, she said, you seemed so lost. How did you know this was what you wanted to do? The question cut deeper than she probably realized. The truth was, I hadn't known. I had been running away from failure rather than running toward success. But somewhere in that desperate escape, I had found something that fit me in a way nothing else ever had. I didn't know, I admitted. I just knew I couldn't keep living the way I was. The military gave me structure, but the special operations training gave me purpose. Daniel leaned forward, his analytical mind still working through the implications. The psychological testing for something like that must be intense. What do they look for? Mental resilience, mostly. The ability to function under extreme stress without breaking down or making fatal mistakes. They put you in situations designed to find your breaking point, then see if you can push past it. I thought about the psychological evaluations during Buddes, where military psychologists had probed every weakness, every fear, every potential point of failure. They had techniques for identifying candidates who would crack under pressure, who would endanger their teammates, who would compromise missions when things got desperate. What was the hardest part? Rachel asked, though I could see her bracing for an answer she might not want to hear. The hardest part. There were so many ways to answer that question. The physical torture of Hell Week, the mental pressure of knowing that life would depend on my decisions, the isolation of not being able to share any of it with the people who mattered most to me. Honestly, not being able to tell any of you, I said. Going through the hardest thing I'd ever done, and not having my family there to support me. But I needed to prove to myself that I could finish something difficult before I could ask for your respect. The admission hung in the air between us. Uncle Robert, who had been uncharacteristically quiet since the officers left, finally spoke up. His voice was subdued, lacking the bombastic confidence he'd displayed earlier. When I was in the reserves, he said slowly, we had a couple people who tried out for special forces. Neither one made it past the first week. He looked at me with something approaching awe. I had no idea what that actually meant until tonight. Coming from Uncle Robert, who had spent the evening lecturing me about lacking military discipline, this was as close to an apology as I was likely to get. More importantly, it was acknowledgement that his earlier assessment had been catastrophically wrong. Amanda had been quiet during most of the questioning, but I could see her business training kicking in as she processed what she was learning. The physical conditioning required for underwater work, she said. Your lung capacity, your cardiovascular fitness, you're operating at a level that most professional athletes never reach. She was right, though I hadn't thought about it in those terms. The training had pushed my body beyond normal human limits, but it had happened gradually enough that it felt natural. Swimming miles in the open ocean, holding my breath for impossible lengths of time, carrying heavy equipment through hostile terrain, these had become routine parts of my job. The scary part, I said, is that everyone on my team can do the same things. We're not superhumans, we're just ordinary people who refuse to quit when things got impossible. My dad had been processing everything with the careful deliberation that had made him successful in his engineering career. The secrecy, he said finally. How much of what you do can you actually tell us? More than you might think, less than you'd probably like, I replied. I can talk about training, general mission types, and the countries where we operate, but specific operations, target details, methods, that stays classified. The limitation clearly frustrated him, but he nodded with understanding. He had worked on defense contracts early in his career and understood the necessity of operational security. The mission they mentioned, my mom said, her voice tight with worry. How long will you be gone? Could be anywhere from 2 weeks to 6 months, depending on how things develop. Joint operation usually means we're working with allied forces, which tends to be less dangerous than solo missions, but more politically complex. I could see her calculating the implications, 6 months of not knowing where I was, what I was doing, whether I was safe. It was a burden that military families carried, but one she had never expected to bear. The conversation was interrupted by my phone buzzing with a text message. I glanced at it quickly, expecting something routine, but the sender made me pause. Lieutenant Commander Martinez, my team leader, wasn't someone who sent casual messages on Thanksgiving. Everything okay? Daniel asked, noticing my expression. I read the message twice before answering. Yeah, just interesting timing. I looked up at my family, all of whom were watching me with new attention to my reactions. My team leader says congratulations are in order, but she didn't specify what. The cryptic message was typical of Martinez, who had a talent for providing just enough information to be intriguing without actually explaining anything useful. But combined with the unusual visit from Williams and Brooks, it suggested that something significant was happening with my career. Rachel looked confused. Congratulations for what? Getting deployed? That's what I need to find out, I said, already mentally preparing for the phone call I'd need to make once dinner was over. My aunt, who had been quietly observing the transformation of her niece from family disappointment to military hero, spoke up for the first time since the officers had left. Emma, I owe you an apology. We all do. We made assumptions about your life without bothering to understand what you were actually doing. The apology was unexpected and more meaningful than she probably realized. These weren't people who apologized easily or often. The fact that they were willing to acknowledge how wrong they had been said something important about their character. You didn't know because I didn't tell you, I replied. I chose to keep this private until I was sure I could see it through, but even as I said it, I realized that wasn't entirely true. Part of me had enjoyed having this secret, knowing that their low expectations were so completely off base. There had been a certain satisfaction in listening to their concerns about my lack of direction, while knowing that I was actually exceeding every measure of success they could imagine. Amanda had been studying me with the clinical eye she used on difficult marketing campaigns. The person who left here 2 years ago, she said slowly, she's not the same person sitting at this table now. She was right, and not just in the obvious ways. The physical transformation was visible, but the mental and emotional changes ran deeper. I had learned to trust my own judgment under pressure, to lead others when failure meant death, to push past barriers that had once seemed absolute. Military service changes people, I said. Special operations change them more. Uncle Robert leaned forward, his earlier bluster replaced by genuine curiosity. What's the biggest difference? I mean, how do you see yourself differently now? The question required more thought than the others. How do you explain to civilians that you've learned to function in a world where hesitation kills people, where split-second decisions determine mission success, where your teammates trust you with their lives based on your reputation for competence under fire? I used to worry about failing, I said finally. Now I know I can handle failure and keep going. I used to avoid difficult situations. Now I specialize in solving problems that other people can't handle. The confidence in that statement wasn't arrogance. It was earned through years of proving myself in situations that would break most people. But I could see how foreign it sounded coming from someone they remembered as chronically uncertain about everything. Daniel was shaking his head slowly. I can't believe we spent 2 years worrying about you not having direction in life. To be fair, I replied, the person you were worrying about really didn't have direction. This version of me is different. My phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Martinez. I looked at the display, then at my family, who were all watching expectantly. I need to take this, I said, standing up from the table. It's my commanding officer. The weight of that phrase hit them again. Their family member, who they had thought was directionless and underachieving, was receiving calls from commanding officers on Thanksgiving evening. The cognitive dissonance was almost visible on their faces. I walked into the next room and answered the call. Lieutenant Carter. Emma, glad I caught you. Hope I'm not interrupting family time too badly. No ma'am, it's fine. What's the situation? Well, first, congratulations on the promotion. Your captain's bars came through this morning, effective immediately. Captain. The word hit me like a physical blow. I had been hoping for that promotion for months, but having it confirmed on Thanksgiving felt surreal. Thank you, ma'am. I wasn't expecting the news today. That's not all. The joint operation we discussed. It's been upgraded to a leadership position. You'll be commanding the multinational team, not just participating. The implications of that hit me immediately. Commanding a multinational special operations team wasn't just a career milestone, it was recognition that I had earned the trust of not just my own superiors, but allied military leaders who had requested me specifically for this role. When do you need an answer, ma'am? You already gave it when you accepted the deployment. The promotion just makes it official. Congratulations, Captain Carter. You've earned it. The call ended, and I stood in my parents' living room staring at my phone, trying to process what had just happened. Captain Carter. In 2 years, I had gone from aimless civilian to Navy SEAL captain commanding international operations. When I walked back into the dining room, my family was exactly where I had left them, but their expectant expressions suggested they had been speculating about the call while I was gone.
Well,
My mom asked. I looked around the table at these people who had spent the evening discovering that everything they thought they knew about me was wrong. I just got promoted to captain, I said simply. The silence that followed was different from the earlier shocks. This wasn't confusion or disbelief. This was awe. Captain Carter. The words felt strange even in my own mind. 3 hours ago, I had walked into this house as the family disappointment, the one who couldn't get her life together. Now I was sitting at the same table as a newly promoted Navy SEAL captain who would be commanding an international special operations team. The promotion changed something fundamental about how my family was looking at me. The lieutenant had been impressive enough, but the captain carried weight that even civilians understood. This wasn't just someone who had found a decent job. This was someone who had risen to a level of leadership that most military personnel never achieved. My dad was the first to find his voice. Captain, he said, testing how the word sounded. Jesus, Emma, do you realize what this means? I wasn't entirely sure he knew what it meant either, but I could see him trying to process the implications. His daughter, who he had worried might never find direction in life, was now trusted to lead elite military units from multiple countries. It means a lot of responsibility, I said, which was the understatement of the century. It means other people's lives depend on the decisions I make. Daniel was looking at me like he was seeing a completely different person. The leadership training for something like that must be intense. It's ongoing, I replied. Military leadership isn't something you learn once and then apply. Every mission teaches you something new about making decisions under pressure. The truth was that leadership in special operations was unlike anything taught in business schools or civilian management programs. When your decisions determined whether your team completed the mission and went home alive, the stakes transformed everything about how you approached problems. Rachel had been unusually quiet since the promotion announcement. As someone who prided herself on career success, having her previously directionless older sister suddenly outrank most military officers was clearly requiring some mental adjustment. The people you'll be commanding, she said finally. Are they all like you? Special operations personnel from different countries? Yeah. British SAS, German KSK, maybe some others depending on mission requirements. All people who've been through similar training to what I completed. The casual mention of elite units from allied nations hit them with fresh impact. This wasn't just about American military service anymore. This was about international cooperation at the highest levels of military operations. Amanda leaned back in her chair, shaking her head slowly. I don't even know what to say. This morning I thought you were working at mall security somewhere. This morning you were lecturing me about not having a real career, I pointed out, though without malice. The irony was too perfect to ignore. She had the grace to look embarrassed. I was completely wrong about everything. We all were. Uncle Robert, who had been uncharacteristically subdued since his earlier humiliation, spoke up again. Emma, I owe you more than an apology. I was out of line earlier, and I was wrong about, well, everything. The acknowledgement meant more than he probably realized. Uncle Robert wasn't someone who admitted being wrong easily or often, but the evidence was too overwhelming to deny. His assessment of my character and potential had been catastrophically incorrect. Robert, I said, you weren't entirely wrong about needing discipline and direction, you were just wrong about me not having found them. My mom had been quietly crying for the past few minutes, though whether from pride, relief, or regret, I couldn't tell. When she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. I'm so proud of you, she said, but I'm also heartbroken that you went through all of this alone. The training, the danger, the achievements, we should have been there to support you. The pain in her voice cut deeper than any criticism ever had. She was right. They should have been there. But they couldn't have been there for something they didn't know existed. Mom, I said gently, I needed to do this on my own. I needed to prove to myself that I could complete something this difficult before I could ask for your support. But even as I said it, I realized that wasn't the complete truth. Part of me had enjoyed having this secret, knowing that their concerns about my future were so completely unfounded. There had been satisfaction in listening to their advice about finding direction, while knowing I had already found more purpose than most people ever discovered. My phone buzzed with another message, this time from Williams. Captain Carter. Your new dress blues will be ready for pickup Monday. Congratulations on a well-deserved promotion. The message reminded me that in 4 days I would report for duty as Captain Carter, commanding officer of a multinational special operations team. The life I had built in secret was about to become very real and very demanding. When you deploy on Tuesday, my dad said, how often will we be able to communicate? Depends on the operation. Sometimes regular email and video calls, sometimes radio silence for weeks at a time. It varies based on security requirements and operational tempo. The uncertainty was hard for civilian families to understand. In their world, communication was constant and expected. In mine, operational security often meant cutting all contact with the outside world for extended periods. Daniel had been working through the technical implications. The command structure for international operations. How does that work? Who do you report to? Unified command structure under NATO protocols, but the specifics depend on mission parameters. I'll know more after Monday's briefing. The military jargon felt natural to me now, but I could see it was like speaking a foreign language to my family. The world I inhabited was as alien to them as their civilian concerns had become to me. My aunt, who had been quietly observing the conversation, spoke up with a question that cut to the heart of everything. Emma, she said, are you happy? I mean really happy with the life you've built. The question surprised me with its directness. Was I happy? It wasn't something I thought about often in those terms. Satisfaction, pride, purpose, those were concepts that mattered more in my world than happiness. I'm proud of what I've accomplished, I said, after considering my answer. I'm doing work that matters, with people I respect, at a level I never thought I could reach. If that's happiness, then yes. But there was a cost, and we all knew it. The secrecy, the danger, the isolation from family and normal life, these weren't trivial sacrifices. The person I had become was strong and capable and respected, but she was also someone who lived in a world that most people couldn't enter or understand. Rachel had been processing everything with the analytical approach that made her successful in medicine. The trajectory of your career, she said slowly. Where does it go from here? Hard to say. Special operations careers are different from regular military progression. Success is measured more by mission completion and team performance than traditional advancement metrics. But privately, I knew that commanding international operations at my age was an exceptional achievement. The promotion to captain had come faster than normal, which suggested that higher command saw potential for continued advancement. Where that might lead was anyone's guess. The conversation was interrupted by my phone ringing again. This time the caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the area code suggested it was from Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado. I should take this, I said, stepping away from the table again. Captain Carter? Speaking. Ma'am, this is Admiral Richardson's office. The Admiral wanted to personally congratulate you on your promotion and express her confidence in your upcoming command. Admiral Richardson, the head of Naval Special Warfare Command. The fact that she was personally calling to acknowledge my promotion suggested this was more significant than I had initially realized. Thank you, sir. I'm honored by the Admiral's confidence. Ma'am, there's one more thing. The Admiral wanted you to know that your performance evaluation has been flagged for accelerated review. Depending on mission outcomes over the next year, you may be considered for additional advancement ahead of normal timelines. The implications hit me immediately. Accelerated advancement in special operations meant being fast-tracked for positions that typically required years more experience. It was recognition that I had demonstrated capabilities beyond my current rank. When I returned to the dining room, my family was waiting with the same expectant expressions they'd worn all evening. That was Admiral Richardson's office, I said simply, congratulating me on the promotion and discussing future opportunities. The name meant nothing to them, but the tone suggested it was significant. My dad raised an eyebrow questioningly. Admiral Richardson heads Naval Special Warfare Command. She's responsible for all SEAL operations worldwide. The magnitude of that hit them like another wave. The head of all SEAL operations worldwide, had personally called to congratulate their family member, who they had thought was working mall security that morning. As I looked around the table at my family, still processing, still adjusting, still trying to reconcile the person they thought they knew with the reality of who I had become, I realized something important had changed beyond just their perception of me. I had spent 2 years proving myself in secret, earning respect from people who didn't know me before I enlisted. But tonight, for the first time, I had earned the respect of the people who mattered most to me, not because they had to love me as family, but because I had genuinely accomplished something worthy of their admiration. The timer on my mom's phone went off, reminding us that there was still pie cooling in the kitchen, but somehow, dessert seemed less important than it had a few hours ago. We had all gotten something better than pie tonight. We had gotten the truth, and it had changed everything. As we finally moved toward the kitchen, Uncle Robert fell into step beside me. "Emma," he said quietly, "I meant what I said about the apology. But I also want you to know, I'm proud to be related to you." Coming from the man who had spent the evening lecturing me about lacking military discipline, it was perhaps the most meaningful acknowledgement I could have received. Tomorrow I will begin preparing for a mission that could last months, commanding elite operators from allied nations in operations I couldn't discuss with my family. But tonight, for the first time in years, I was exactly where I belonged, at home with people who finally understood who I had become. Captain Carter. It still sounded strange, but it felt exactly right. The rest of that Thanksgiving evening unfolded unlike any family gathering we'd ever experienced. The traditional post-dinner routine of football and leftovers was replaced by something resembling a military debriefing, with my family asking increasingly sophisticated questions about a world they were just beginning to understand. My mom had retrieved a notebook from her kitchen drawer and was actually taking notes, as if she needed to document this revelation to make it feel real. She had always been the family historian, the one who preserved important moments, but this felt different. She was recording information about a daughter she was meeting for the first time. "The physical training," she said, pen poised over paper. "What does a typical day look like?" I considered how to explain a routine that would sound like torture to most civilians. Early morning PT starts around 0500, running, swimming, calisthenics, weight training. Then mission-specific training, could be anything from close quarters combat to underwater navigation to helicopter insertions. She wrote it down dutifully, though I could see her trying to picture her daughter voluntarily waking up at 5 in the morning to swim in the Pacific Ocean. The Emma she remembered had to be dragged out of bed for school. Daniel was approaching this with his characteristic engineering precision. "The selection rate for SEAL training, you mentioned it was low. What are the actual numbers?" "About 80% of candidates don't complete BUD/S. Of those who do complete it, not everyone gets assigned to active SEAL teams. The overall success rate from initial application to operational deployment is roughly 15%. The statistics hung in the air like a challenge to everything they thought they knew about probability and achievement. In their world, 15% success rates indicated poor planning or unrealistic expectations. In mine, they indicated the difference between elite and ordinary. Rachel had been calculating something on her phone. "If you started with, say, 100 candidates in your class, we started with 196 for initial screening," I said. 12 made it to BUD/S graduation. 4 of us completed the full pipeline to team assignment." She stared at her phone screen, then at me. "That's just over 2%. "Math checks out," I confirmed. Uncle Robert had sobered up considerably since the naval officer's visit, and his questions had become more thoughtful. "The mental pressure during that training. How do you push through when your body is telling you to quit?" It was a question that went to the heart of what separated successful candidates from everyone else. Physical capability was important, but mental resilience was what determined who wore the trident and who rang the bell. "You learn that your mind will try to quit long before your body actually reaches its limits," I explained. "The training teaches you to recognize the difference between genuine physical failure and psychological discomfort. Most people quit because they're uncomfortable, not because they're actually incapable." But even that explanation didn't capture the reality of lying in 50-degree surf at 3 in the morning, hypothermic and exhausted, while instructors screamed at you to maintain position. The decision to continue in those moments came from something deeper than rational thought. Amanda had been quiet for a while, but I could see her processing everything through her business background. The psychological screening for special operations, what are they looking for specifically? Stress inoculation, primarily. They want to see how you function when everything goes wrong simultaneously. Can you make good decisions when you're exhausted, scared, and under extreme pressure? Do you maintain team cohesion when individual survival instincts kick in? She nodded with professional understanding. In her work in marketing, she had seen how people responded to high-stakes presentations, how some rose to the occasion while others fell apart completely. The techniques they used to test that, she continued, are they designed to replicate actual mission conditions? Some of them. But the real test comes later, during actual operations. Training can simulate a lot, but it can't replicate the knowledge that failure might mean people die. The weight of that responsibility was something I carried every day now. Every decision, every action, every moment of preparation was informed by the understanding that other people's lives depended on my competence. My aunt had been observing the conversation with the quiet attention of someone trying to understand a foreign culture. "Emma," she said, "when you're deployed, when you're in dangerous situations, do you think about us, about home?" The question touched on something I didn't often allow myself to examine. The psychological compartmentalization required for special operations meant learning to separate personal concerns from professional focus. But that didn't mean the connections disappeared. During missions, I can't afford to think about anything except the mission, I said honestly. But afterward, when we're back at base, yeah, I think about home, about whether I'm making you proud or just worrying you unnecessarily. My mom looked up from her notebook with tears in her eyes again. "Emma, honey, you could never worry us unnecessarily. We just want to know you're safe, and that you're doing something that fulfills you." But safety was a relative concept in my world. Safer than active combat, certainly, but risk was an accepted part of the job. The question wasn't whether there was danger, but whether the mission was important enough to justify that risk. My dad had been processing everything with his characteristic methodical approach. "The chain of command," he said. "When you're leading this international team, who exactly are you accountable to?" Unified command structure means I report to a joint task force commander, probably a Navy captain or Army colonel. But operationally, once we're in the field, I have considerable autonomy in how we accomplish mission objectives. The level of independent authority granted to special operations commanders was something that civilians often struggled to understand. In most professions, important decisions were made by committees or required multiple approvals. In special operations, circumstances often demanded immediate action based on the judgment of the person on the ground. "The responsibility of that," Daniel said slowly, "making decisions that affect international operations, that's not something they teach in business school." "It's not something they teach anywhere," I replied. "You learn it by doing it, starting with smaller responsibilities and building up to larger ones. By the time you're commanding international operations, you've already proven you can handle the pressure." But the truth was, no amount of training fully prepared you for the moment when you realized that your decisions would influence relationships between allied nations. That mission's success or failure could affect diplomatic relations for years to come. Rachel had been unusually quiet, and I could see her struggling with something. Finally, she spoke up. "Emma, I owe you an apology too. For years, I thought I was the successful one in the family. I thought my career in medicine was somehow more important than whatever you were doing." The admission clearly cost her something. Rachel had always taken pride in being the high achiever, the one with the impressive career and bright future. "Your career is important," I said. Different doesn't mean better or worse. But we both knew that wasn't entirely true. Saving lives in a hospital, however, skillfully, didn't carry the same weight as leading special operations missions that could affect national security. The comparison wasn't fair to either of us, but it was unavoidable. "Still," she continued, "I want you to know that I respect what you've accomplished. More than that, I'm genuinely impressed. What you've done requires a level of commitment and capability that I'm not sure I could match." The acknowledgement from Rachel meant more than she probably realized. She was someone whose opinion I had always valued, even when I felt like I wasn't living up to her example. My phone buzzed with a text from one of my teammates. "Heard about the promotion, Captain. Well deserved. See you Monday for a briefing. The message was a reminder that this family dinner existed in a bubble. In 2 days I would return to a world where Captain Carter was the norm, where everyone understood the significance of the rank and the responsibilities it carried. The team you'll be commanding, my mom asked, reading over my shoulder, do they know about your background? About how quickly you've advanced? Some of it. Military records speak for themselves. But in special operations, your reputation is built more on performance than paperwork. They know I've earned the promotion because someone trusted me with this command. The meritocracy of special operations was both harsh and fair. Your background, your connections, your family name, none of that mattered when lives were on the line. What mattered was whether you could deliver results when everything depended on your performance. Uncle Robert had been listening to the conversation with increasing humility. Emma, he said. Earlier tonight I lectured you about needing military discipline. I want you to know how ashamed I am of that now. Robert, I replied, you weren't wrong about military discipline being valuable. You were just wrong about me not having it. But his embarrassment was understandable. He had spent the evening criticizing someone for lacking something they had actually mastered at an elite level. It was like criticizing a concert pianist for not knowing how to play music. As the evening wound down, I realized that something fundamental had shifted in our family dynamic, not just their perception of me, but my relationship with all of them. For the first time in years, I felt like I belonged at this table, not because we shared DNA, but because they respected who I had become. The next morning would bring preparation for deployment, gear checks, and briefings on classified operations. But tonight I was just Emma Carter, sitting in her childhood home with people who finally understood the woman she had worked to become. Tomorrow, I will be Captain Carter again. Tonight, for the first time in years, I was both versions of myself simultaneously, and they finally fit together. Sunday morning arrived with the kind of clarity that only comes after life-changing revelations. I woke up in my childhood bedroom, but everything felt different. The room looked the same, the desk where I'd struggled through high school homework, the window I'd stared out of while wondering what I was supposed to do with my life, but I was seeing it through different eyes. Downstairs, my mom was already making breakfast with the determined energy she always deployed when processing major emotions. She had always been someone who worked through problems with her hands, and this morning she was channeling her adjustment to having a Navy SEAL captain for a daughter into what appeared to be enough pancakes to feed a small platoon. "Morning, sweetheart," she said without looking up from the griddle. The casual endearment felt different now, weighted with new understanding. "I hope you slept well. I know you probably have a lot to prepare for before Tuesday." The acknowledgement of my upcoming deployment was delivered with forced normalcy, as if she was practicing how to be the mother of someone whose job involved classified operations in hostile territories. My dad was reading the newspaper at the kitchen table, but I caught him glancing at me over the top of the pages with expressions that cycled between pride and concern. The man who had spent years worrying about my lack of direction was now grappling with the reality that his daughter's direction involved dangers he couldn't fully comprehend. "Coffee's fresh," he said, gesturing toward the pot. "Though I imagine military coffee is probably stronger than what we make here." It was a small attempt at connecting with my military experience, and I appreciated the effort, even though Navy coffee was indeed significantly stronger than anything my parents would consider drinkable. Over breakfast, the conversation took on a different quality than the previous evening's interrogation. Instead of trying to understand what I did, they were trying to understand how to be family to someone who did it. The adjustment wasn't just about accepting that I was a Navy SEAL, it was about learning how to love and support someone whose life operated according to rules they didn't understand. "When you're deployed," my mom said carefully, "is there anything we should know about communication? About how often we might hear from you?" "It varies by mission," I explained. "Sometimes I can send emails regularly, sometimes radio silence for weeks. I'll always let you know when I can, but there might be periods where you don't hear anything." She nodded, making mental notes about a reality that must have seemed impossible just days earlier. Her daughter's job would sometimes require her to disappear from her life without warning, for reasons she couldn't know, to places she couldn't imagine. "And if something happens," my dad said quietly, If you're injured or worse, how would we find out? The question hung heavy in the kitchen air. It was the fear that military families lived with, the knowledge that a knock on the door might bring news that would change everything forever. Casualty notification procedures are very specific, I said, trying to be reassuring without minimizing the reality. If something happens, you'll be contacted immediately by trained personnel. But the statistical likelihood of that is lower than you might think. But statistics were cold comfort when discussing the possibility of losing a child. I could see both my parents processing the fact that their daughter had voluntarily chosen a profession where casualty notification procedures were a necessary consideration. My phone rang, interrupting the heavy moment. The caller ID showed Master Chief Williams, and I knew this wasn't a social call the day before deployment preparation. "Excuse me," I said, stepping into the next room. "Master Chief, Captain Carter, sorry to call on Sunday, but we've got updated intelligence on the joint operation. Can you be here by 1400 for an emergency briefing?" The shift in her tone from yesterday's congratulatory visit was immediately apparent. This was operational business, urgent enough to interrupt weekend leave. Affirmative. "What's the nature of the update?" "Mission parameters have changed. Timeline's been accelerated. We deploy Monday night instead of Tuesday." The news hit like a physical blow. I had been counting on one more day with my family, one more day to help them adjust to this new reality before disappearing into the classified world of special operations. "Understood. I'll be there." When I returned to the kitchen, my parents read the change in my expression immediately. "What is it?" my mom asked, though her voice suggested she already knew it wasn't good news. "Mission's been moved up. I need to report for a briefing this afternoon, and we deploy tonight instead of Tuesday." The disappointment on their faces was quickly replaced by resignation. They were learning that military families didn't get to control schedules or plan around deployments. Operations happened when they needed to happen, regardless of personal convenience. "How long will you be gone?" Daniel asked. He had arrived that morning for what was supposed to be a farewell brunch, but was now becoming an abbreviated goodbye. "Unknown. Could be 2 weeks, could be 6 months. Depends on how the situation develops." The uncertainty was perhaps harder for them to accept than a definitive timeline would have been. In their civilian world, business trips had scheduled return dates, vacations had planned durations. Military operations ended when mission objectives were achieved, not when calendar dates arrived. Rachel showed up an hour later, having driven down from San Francisco after getting my text about the accelerated timeline. She walked into a house that felt like it was holding its breath, where everyone was trying to figure out how to say goodbye to someone whose job they were just beginning to understand. "So this is really happening," she said, sitting down at the kitchen table that had been the site of so many family conversations, but never one quite like this. "This is what I do," I replied. "It's what I've been doing for 2 years, you're just finding out about it now." But that wasn't entirely fair. Yes, I had been deploying on classified missions for years, but this was the first time my family would experience it consciously, knowing where I was going and why, understanding the risks involved, and the responsibilities I carried. Uncle Robert arrived with my aunt, apparently having been summoned by the family phone tree that activated during significant events. He looked subdued, still processing his complete misjudgment of my character and capabilities. "Emma," he said simply, "I wanted to see you before you left. To wish you luck and tell you again how wrong I was about everything." The apology felt genuine, but more importantly, it felt final. Uncle Robert was putting to rest years of condescending lectures and misplaced advice, acknowledging that the person he had been trying to fix was actually the person who had fixed herself. As the afternoon progressed, I found myself watching my family with new eyes. These people who had known me longest were also, in many ways, the people who knew me least. They had loved the confused, directionless version of Emma Carter, but they were just meeting Captain Carter for the first time. The challenge moving forward would be integrating these two identities in a way that preserved both the family relationships I valued and the professional competence I had earned. For 2 years I had kept these worlds completely separate. Now they would have to coexist. At 1300 hours I changed into my dress blues for the drive to base. The uniform that had once felt foreign now fit like a second skin, but putting it on in my childhood bedroom created a surreal juxtaposition of past and present. When I came downstairs, the effect on my family was immediate and profound. They had seen me in civilian clothes during our entire conversation about my military career. Seeing me in uniform, with captain's bars, ribbons, and the trident insignia that identified me as a Navy SEAL, made everything suddenly, undeniably real. My mom started crying again, but these were different tears than the ones she had shed the night before. These weren't tears of shock or confusion, but tears of pride mixed with the kind of fear that comes with loving someone whose job involves genuine danger. "You look," she started, then stopped, unable to find words that captured what she was seeing. "Like a stranger," I replied. "Like our daughter," my dad corrected. "But also like someone we're just meeting for the first time." It was the most accurate description anyone had offered. I was both the kid they had raised and the woman I had become through experiences they couldn't share. The uniform represented a transformation that went far deeper than clothing. The goodbye that followed was unlike any our family had ever shared. Previous departures had been casual affairs. "See you soon, drive safely, call when you get there." This goodbye carried weight that none of us quite knew how to handle. My mom hugged me with the fierce intensity of someone who wasn't sure when she would see me again. My dad shook my hand, then pulled me into an embrace that lasted longer than any we had shared since I was a child. Daniel and Rachel both looked like they wanted to say something profound but couldn't find the right words. "How do you encapsulate the reversal of everything you thought you knew about someone into a single farewell?" "Bring yourself home safe," Daniel finally said. "That's all we want." As I drove toward base, I found myself thinking about identity and transformation, about the journey from family disappointment to someone worthy of their pride. The person I had been wasn't a failure, she was just incomplete. Everything that had seemed like weakness or lack of direction had actually been potential waiting for the right catalyst. The naval base came into view, all concrete and steel and purposeful activity. In a few hours I would be Captain Carter again, commanding international special operations personnel in missions I couldn't describe to the people I loved most. But for the first time since enlisting, I felt like both versions of myself could coexist. I wasn't just the family member who had surprised everyone, and I wasn't just the military officer who had earned rapid advancement. I was Emma Carter, who had found her calling in service to something larger than herself, and who had finally earned the respect of the people whose opinions mattered most. Tonight I would deploy to locations I couldn't name, for purposes I couldn't discuss, leading people whose lives would depend on decisions I would make under pressure most civilians couldn't imagine. But yesterday, I had a daughter, a sister, a niece, and a cousin who had finally come home to a family that understood who she had become. Sometimes the most important victories aren't the ones that earn you medals or promotions. Sometimes they're the ones that earn you the respect of people who have loved you all along, but are finally meeting the person you fought to become. Captain Carter reported for duty that evening, ready for whatever challenges the mission would bring. But she carried with her something she had never had before: the knowledge that Emma Carter finally had a place at her family's table, not because they felt sorry for her, but because they were proud of her. And that made all the difference. Looking for more? We've got two amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.